Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. So, in today's lecture, we enter into the year 7 of the Hijrah, and the main event which will take up the bulk of our discussion is the issue of Khaybar, the siege of the fortresses or the city of Khaybar. It has multiple fortresses, which is sort of the last strongholds of the Jews that reneged on their agreement with the Prophet. Of course, not all the Jewish tribes did this, some of them did. And as the Prophet, with Qaynuqa and Qurayda, etc., they start amassing in Khaybar. Not all of them go to the Levant, some of them go to Khaybar. And this is the story of how that ends. And this actually is a direct result of the Treaty of Al-Hudaybiyah, because Khaybar is to the north of Medina. So the Treaty of Hudaybiyah secures the southern flank, I guess you could say, of Medina. So there's no more agitation from Quraysh. All they have to worry about is the north, which is Khaybar, and then the far east, Najd, which we talked about a little bit yesterday. So this is going to be the bulk of the discussion of what happens after the treaty, and then how the Prophet ﷺ chooses to deal with the issue of Khaybar. There's a lot of treachery involved. It's a very sad story, but it's an important one. And then this will take us to the final battles of the 7th year of the Hijrah, and then we enter into the 8th year of the Hijrah, in which we have the final battles of that year, which are kind of smaller skirmishes, which we'll talk about. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to mention. And this will lead us right up until the conquest of Mecca. And then, of course, we have the conquest of Mecca, and then the battles that subsume after the conquest of Mecca, Hunayn, and then after that the return to Medina, and then the passing of the Prophet ﷺ to Al-Rafiq al-A'la. So these are kind of the major issues that we have left in lecture 13, 14, and 15. But for today in 13, we're going to focus on Khaybar, keeping in mind all of the things that we've talked about in the past lectures about the state of Medina, the constitution of Medina, what the constitution requires of the various tribes that willingly agreed to join into this confederation, and keeping in mind that this is a direct result of the Treaty of Al-Hudaybiyah, because now the Prophet ﷺ can tend to the issues of the north. We'll begin the discussion as usual in the next clip, inshallah. All right. As I was saying in the introductory clip, we want to just recall very quickly that part of the benefits of the Treaty of Al-Hudaybiyah is that there's peace now between Mecca and Medina, and whoever wants to join the Meccans in a confederation are free to do so. Of course, very few do that, and whoever wants to join the state of Medina are free to do so, and that is actually what ends up happening. But also an auxiliary benefit is if we have Medina and the south is Mecca, the southern part, the southern border, that theater of war is now closed, at least theoretically, due to the peace treaty. Now we're going to deal with Khaybar in the north, it's about 60, 80 miles north of Medina, 60 to 80 kilometers north of Medina. And then we have Najd on the east, which will be the third theater that the Prophet ﷺ will deal with after today's lecture. We'll talk about that. Before Khaybar, by 3 days, there was the battle of Ghaba, or the battle of Dhul Qird. This was a preemptive attack by Ghatafan to steal the Prophet's livestock, alayhi salatu wasalam. And the hero of this battle is Salama ibn Aqwa, radiallahu anhu. He single-handedly saved the livestock and fought off the enemy. And one of the traits of Salama is that during the fitna that happens later in the Khilafah of Uthman and Imam Ali alayhi salam, Uthman radiallahu anhu, is he goes and he leaves all of the fitna and goes to the desert. And the companions told him, didn't you hear that the Prophet ﷺ disliked going out and to live in the desert alone after we've created a state? And he said, yes, but didn't you hear the Prophet ﷺ? He said, except in times of fitna. It's important hadith, and there's a theme in the hadith literature in the times of fitna to be by yourself. Either to be by yourself where you are, hilsan min ahlasi baytik, the Prophet ﷺ said, be with your home and your people, your family and your people, or like Salama radiallahu anhu, Ibn Aqwa did radiallahu anhu, is he just left. He's like, I don't want any part of this. That's a sort of an important kind of quality about him. Okay, and then Salama plays another role in Khaybar, so he'll stay with us. We have Khaybar, as I said, is about 60 to 80 kilometers north of Medina. And this also shows us, as something I mentioned before, when we talked about the state of Medina, it's properly called a nation state because these are not little neighborhoods inside what we think of as the city of Medina. These are a whole amalgamation of tribes in a geographic area. Unfortunately, I don't have the stats on how big that geographic area is, but that would be very interesting if we drew borders around it and kind of how many square miles or square kilometers is the state. It's a state. Khaybar was also one of the tribes that was responsible for rallying the Confederates against Medina during the Battle of the Ditch. So this is a continuation of the Ahzab, a continuation of the Battle of the Ditch. It's just, it took the Prophet some time to get to the point where he can deal with that. Khaybar also was responsible for trying to assassinate the Prophet ﷺ several times. So at the end of Muharram in the year 7 of the Hijrah, after the Battle of Dhul Qird with Salam ibn Aqwa radiallahu anhu saves the livestock of the Prophet ﷺ, now the Prophet ﷺ heads north with his people to Khaybar. And after the Treaty of Al-Hudaybiyah and during this military excursion, the Prophet ﷺ did not accept any hypocrites to go with him because of course he knew who they were. So the fighting force of the Prophet ﷺ at this time was 1,400 fighters. I mean, mashallah, Badr was 313 and now we're at 1,400. So kind of shows you from a statistical point of view the increase in population, the increase of the fighting force. It was at this time that Abu Huraira came into Islam and came into Medina, just like as a kind of a data point, since he's such a famous Sahabi and one of the main ones to narrate the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul, unfortunately, he's still with us. He sends a message to Khaybar to warn them. And this is the way of the hypocrites throughout the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. He tells Khaybar the number of the Prophet's force ﷺ. He says their numbers are low relative to the people that are in Khaybar. And he also mentions and enumerates kind of the weapons that they have. So therefore, when Khaybar receives this news, now of course, an army will move slower than an individual messenger. And that's why throughout the seerah, and this is something that, as a young man, it took me a while to realize that a guy on a horse that's like darting messages back and forth is going to move much faster than the whole army itself. And that's why the intelligence will arrive before. So Khaybar sends them out to Ghatafan to try to have enforcements. Ghatafan actually came down to Khaybar, but they fell into a state of confusion and assumed that the Prophet ﷺ would know about their movement, and then the Prophet ﷺ would skip Khaybar and attack Ghatafan, which was now left unguarded. So this was actually kind of like a tactical mistake from Ghatafan. One, that they moved on Khaybar based on this notion to come and join and fight the Prophet ﷺ, and also to leave their homes exposed. Obviously, this was not the intention of the Prophet ﷺ, and neither did that happen. So they actually retreated. So they actually did not end up coming all the way to Khaybar to fight. The Prophet ﷺ is doing mashura, war council, asking his companions, what do we do? So an expert told him, look, let's bypass Khaybar and approach Khaybar from the north. So if Medina is here, Khaybar is here, the Levant is here. They said, come from the north and attack Khaybar from the north, and that way you block off Khaybar from the Levant, which is the major trading, that's like the major highway, the major supply lines, retreat lines. I mean, this is serious, a serious type of threat. So this is what the Prophet ﷺ chose to do. Now, along the journey, we have the story of Amir ibn al-Aqwa. He started to recite poetry, and this is something that we know from the seerah. The Prophet ﷺ loved very much and encouraged. And when he finished, he said, Yarhamuhullah. And the companions knew when the Prophet ﷺ said this about him, that this was a foretelling that he would die in battle. As they draw near to Khaybar, they eat and pray, and then the Prophet ﷺ turns into sincere supplication, asking for good of the land as they enter it. They arrive at night, but the Prophet ﷺ did not kind of press and lay siege until the morning. And this is also a sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, is he wouldn't attack a city at night. They entered after Fajr, and the people of Khaybar nonetheless were taken completely by surprise. So even though they had the intelligence, and even though they sent for reinforcements, and even though the Prophet ﷺ didn't attack at night, subhanAllah, still they were like, oh my God, it's actually kind of happening. Let's talk a little bit about the fortress of Khaybar. I think it's a better way to talk about a fortress or a city. A fortress, I think, makes sense. There were two sections. The first had 5 fortresses grouped in 3 and 2, meaning that they were in different locations. And then the second section had 3 fortresses. Okay, that's a total of 8 fortresses. That's a lot. So it's not like a little town or village or something like that. It's like its own kind of like mini city-state, I guess you could say. All the fighting was with the first section. The second section, it had many fighters, but they surrendered upon the approach of the Prophet ﷺ. So already, like, I don't know, let's say 30 to 35% of the battle is already won without anything, just kind of showing up. The Prophet camped out, and the companion Habab ibn al-Mundhir told him that the place that he camped out is too exposed, and there's a better place to camp, and the Prophet ﷺ agreed with this assessment. And then this is the famous quote of the Prophet ﷺ, tomorrow I will give the flag to someone who loves Allah and loves His Messenger, and His Messenger loves him. Of course, all the companions are like, oh, it's me, it's me, it's me. And of course, it becomes being Imam Ali alayhi salam, who's one of the heroes and one of the valiant, fighters of this episode. The Prophet ﷺ instructed Imam Ali alayhi salam to go to Khaybar and to teach them, because guidance on your hand is better than everything in the world. So even still, despite the treachery, despite the assassination attempts, despite the colluding with the enemy, despite giving away the Medina locations to the enemy, despite all of that, the Prophet ﷺ is still, he has tama, he's hoping and seeking and willing to see that the other, and will do everything he can for the other person or the other side to be guided, even though at this point he had every reason not to do that and just to fight. So this is gonna, I have like 10 seconds left, so this kind of leads us, I don't want to start the next section, this leads us to right before we're going to fight. I just want you to see the disposition of the Prophet ﷺ and how he was dealing with his enemies, and we'll pick up the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, the first fight, they arrive at the fortress called An-Na'im, and the people of Na'im rejected Imam Ali's offer for Islam. And then they sent someone, remember we talked about the dueling, that's kind of how battle was done. So they sent someone to fight one-on-one called Marhaba, and Marhaba was the king or the leader or the head of this fortress. The first fight with Marhaba was with Amir ibn al-Aqwa. He's the uncle of Salama, and he was killed. And then Imam Ali takes over and fights Marhaba and kills him. And then there are another series of duels, as is normal during the time. In this fortress, the Jews of this fortress, they had enough resources to outlast. And this was the case with what we found in the other Jewish fortresses. But the battle lasted a long time, because you're in a fortified fortress, you have weapons, you have supplies, so you can outlast the enemy who's coming with very few resources. But yet, because things got long, they began to give up more morally. So it's like a psychological thing. So they capitulated, and the fortress fell. That's the first fortress. Now we have the second fortress called As-Sab. The Muslims were under the command of Habab ibn al-Mundhir. And they surrounded this fortress for 3 days. The Prophet ﷺ made dua that one of the fortresses with the most provisions would fall, and this happens. And it happened, and then now the Muslims now have resources. So they have food, they have weapons, they have things. So second fortress falls. Now the third fortress, called Az-Zubayr, this was the most fortified, and all the Jews from the previous fortress retreated here. So the first 2 fortresses fall. The Jews, or the inhabitants of the fortresses, flee. They go to the third fortress, and then the Prophet ﷺ laid siege to this for 3 days. So as we're telling the story, you can kind of understand that they're not necessarily they're not contiguous, they're not attached to each other, they're in separate locations. Now, why didn't the Jews from the other fortresses come down and attack? I don't know, but I mean, this is what happened, and you can just see it was just, again, like Ghatafan retreating, this is another tactical mistake that the Jews of Khaybar could have easily probably wiped out the Prophet ﷺ, but they didn't. They held up and they got scared. Somebody came to the Prophet ﷺ to inform him that the resources of the Zubayr fortress were great, but that they would run out of water soon. And he said, if you cut off water from them, they will capitulate. So the Jews of this fortress actually came out to fight. There was a loss of life. The Prophet ﷺ won. So now fortress 3 is done. So we have 3 of the 5 fortresses are gone. So the first collection of fortresses, we said, capitulated early, and then 1, 2, 3. Now we have 2 left. The 4th fortress was called Ubay, the same pattern as before. Abu Dujana dueled in the dueling from the Muslim side, and he won. And after he won, he stormed the castle. Sounds like something from like a fairy tale. He stormed the castle, right? And there was heavy fighting, and then the Muslims won the 4th. Now we have the 5th and last fortress, which is Nazar. The Jews retreated into the final fortress in the section of Khaybar. The Jews were certain that the Muslims couldn't break, so they doubled down inside. The Prophet ﷺ ordered catapults, which in the literature of the Sira is called al-manjaniq. It's just a cool word, I think. So al-manjaniq is the catapults, and the men of the castle fled, leaving the women and the children behind. With this first kind of narration of what I'm saying, the first part of Khaybar has now fallen. And then, sorry, there's something in my notes I wanted to confirm. Afwan. The second section that had 3 fortresses, they did not capitulate right away. First, these events happened. Now we have that second part of Khaybar that had those 3 fortresses. The Prophet ﷺ laid siege to this part of Khaybar for 14 days, for 2 weeks, and the Prophet ﷺ was going to use the catapults, but then there was fear inside Khaybar, and then they capitulated and they're ready to surrender. So this kind of summarizes the major fighting. Now let's talk about how everything ends, because there's still like treachery and loss of life. Ibn Abi al-Haqiq asked to parley with the Prophet ﷺ, and he agreed. Of course, he always agrees to parley. And these were the terms that the Prophet ﷺ gave him: complete surrender, you retreat with nothing, meaning no weapons, no supplies, no weapons, and you pay for safe passage, to go now to the Levant. However, Ibn Abi al-Haqiq buried the money that they had, and in the process killed a companion. The Prophet ﷺ found this out, and then he had Ibn Abi al-Haqiq executed for killing a companion. The final agreement was that they would pay 50% of the hasad, of the harvest of the land, to the Muslims. And the spoils of this were so great that all of the Muhajirun were able to repay their Ansar brothers for all of the things that they had given them and supported them 7 years earlier when they entered into Medina. Ja'far finally ends up coming from Al-Habash. He was there for a long time. When the Prophet he sees him and he kisses him. This is also the story of Our Lady Safiya alayha salam. Her husband had died in the siege. And then Dihya was going to take a slave. That was part of warfare at the time. And he took Safiya. But the other companions told the Prophet ﷺ, well, Safiya is like a noble, she's like a princess, a Jewish princess, so it's not appropriate that would happen, Dihya would take her. So the Prophet ﷺ took her, offered her Islam, she accepted, since she was already a believer, because we talked about, she had the dream that the moon fell in her lap, etc. The Prophet ﷺ freed her and married her. She had a scar on her face from when her father and uncle struck her, when she had that dream about the moon in her lap and praise of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, this is also the story of the attempt to poison the Prophet ﷺ. This was Zainab bint al-Harith. She gave some meat to the Prophet ﷺ as a gift after Khaybar. The Prophet ﷺ went to go eat it, and then he heard through revelation, or he heard the meat speak to him that he was poisoned. So it wasn't just him eating, it was some companions. So he said, okay, nobody eat this anymore. She confessed that she tried to poison him. But Bishr bin al-Bara died from the poison, and because he was killed through the poison, this lady Zainab was executed, because it's the capital punishment for poisoning somebody. The final death toll. The Muslims lost between 18 to 20, and the Jews lost 93. So from a body count point of view, this is a high body count loss of the Jews. Of course, they lost. I mean, there's no doubt that they lost, and now it's going to be a major source of revenue for the state of Medina. Another Jewish tribe called Fadak heard about the news of Khaybar, and they didn't want to fight. They're like, we want the same deal you gave Khaybar, the 50%. So this was accepted, and this was managed and taken by the Prophet ﷺ. This is a very important issue because this is one of the not major, but this is one of the issues between the Sunnis and the Shias, because after the Prophet ﷺ passed to Al-Rafiq al-A'la, Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam asked Sayyidina Abu Bakr, who was the Khalifa, for her mirath, for her inheritance from Fadak. So Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu said, well, it's not the milk, it's not the ownership of the Prophet. He was just managing it. The Prophet said him and all of the Anbiya, they leave no wealth behind, their inheritances and the knowledge. And so he said, I can't give that to you. It belongs to Dar al-Islam, or Bayt al-Mal. And she was upset with him. And when Sayyidina Abu Bakr realized that she was upset with him, he cried profusely, and he wanted to resign the Khilafah. So this is a Sunni Shia thing. It becomes, that's sort of what I'm presenting you, is how we understand the story based on the sound narrations. Of course, the Shias have their own kind of narration, and that I don't want to get into now because it's not appropriate to do that now. Okay, so this is kind of the end of Khaybar. Now the next battle is the Battle of Wadi al-Qura. These were also smaller, minor Jewish Arab tribes that were against the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. The Prophet's slave Mid'am died in this skirmish, and the companions were praising the Prophet. Oh, mashallah, he's a shaheed. And the Prophet told him, no, he's in the hellfire because he stole from the booty. He just happened to die in the conflict. The battle lasted 4 days, and they got the same 50% deal. And we'll pick up the discussion in the next and final clip, inshallah. Okay. So we talked about Fadak and then Wadi al-Qura. Both of them are going to give 50% of the proceeds of the land to the state of Medina. And then there's Tayma, another Jewish tribe in which they were just given peace outright, and they kept their wealth because there was no agitation from them. So that's why I said not all the Jewish tribes did what Qurayda, Qaynuqa, and Khaybar did. Those were 3 out of the 20 or 19 or 20, I think, different narrations. And let's say 20 Jewish tribes. Only a minority of them we had this problem. Now we return to Medina, and this begins. We enter into Medina in the beginning of Rabi al-Awwal of the 7th year. 7th year of the Hijrah. So end of Muharram, Safar into Rabi'. So Safar, kind of 7 of the Hijrah, is what we were talking about. So Mecca is secure. The southern border is secure from Mecca because of the Hudaybiyah Treaty. The north now is secure because of Khaybar, and Khaybar is kind of like a catchphrase for all of the other minor Jewish tribes we talked about. Now the only border that is not secure is the eastern border, Najd, and this is what the Prophet ﷺ turns his attention to. This was more difficult than the Hudaybiyah Treaty solution and the Khaybar solution, because in the east the tribes are not in one location, so it's more of a threat, but maybe you can say a little further away. In Rabi al-Awwal, in the year 7 of the Hijrah, after we return to Medina, there is the battle of Dhat al-Riqaq. Some Sira authors say this took place in the year 4 of the Hijrah, but some of the companions like Abu Musa al-Ash'ari and Abu Huraira, who are present, would tell us that it took place in the 7th year of the Hijrah, because we just said that Sayyid Abu Hurairah just became Muslim. The Prophet ﷺ went out between 400 and 700, different narrations, and it was about a 2 days ride to meet the tribe of Ghatafan. In the battle was the story of the Prophet ﷺ laying by the tree, and he was kind of napping or just kind of relaxing, and his sword was hung. A man came upon the Prophet ﷺ and put his sword to the Prophet's neck. He said, do you fear me? Are you scared of me? The Prophet ﷺ, no. And then he said, who will protect you from me? And the Prophet said, Allah. And the man got so scared he dropped the sword. So the Prophet ﷺ, he put it toward the man. He said, who's going to save you? And he said, you're a good man from a good family. He got scared. So the Prophet ﷺ let him go. So when he went back to his people, he said, I came from the best of people. There was an attack by one of the people of Ghatafan trying to take revenge. He approached at night and he attacked two men, Abbad ibn Bishr and Ammar ibn Yasir. Abbad was struck while he was praying, but he didn't want to stop because he didn't want to. That was a famous story where he was struck while he was in prayer, but he didn't want to finish the surah. He didn't want to cut off the surah that he was reading. That's another famous story. This battle, while it was small, it created a great deal of fear in the hearts of Ghatafan, and they did not want to fight after that. And this is one of the miracles of the Prophet ﷺ when he said, I've been given victory bil-ru'b, by fear, is that many of the battles of the Prophet ﷺ were actually not battles. They're just sort of, we're going to go out with the intention to fight, but then the enemy gets scared. And that's why I think several lectures ago I gave you guys the stats on all of the body count. So as a result of this, actually, many of the people of Ghatafan become Muslim. And when the Prophet ﷺ conquers Mecca, by that time most of Ghatafan is Muslim. The Prophet ﷺ returns. He remained in Medina until Shawwal of the 7th year of the Hijrah. During this time, he sent other forces and military excursions out. In Dhul Qa'dah of the 7th year of the Hijrah, this was the make-up Umrah that the Prophet ﷺ and the companions were not able to do during the time of Al-Hudaybiyah. This 2,000 went out, and they took their weapons just in case. Before entering Mecca, they left their weapons in a place outside of Mecca, and they left 200 of the 2,000 there to guard the weapons just in case. Quraysh left the city of Mecca so that the Muslims could come in, do the Umrah. They were observing them, and this is the story of the running. There's a sunnah to the first 3 tawaf to run, jog lightly, and then the portion of the sa'i to run in the portion of the sa'i, because those were the areas that the Quraysh could see, and exposing the right shoulder for the men. It's sort of, the rumors were like, oh, these people are sick, they're all covered up, they're a ragtag group of people. So the Prophet said, show them your skin, showed the right shoulder and the running. So every time they see them, they're running. It's like, man, they're running 7 times, that's intense. The Prophet ﷺ and the companions, they stayed for 3 days, and they left according to their agreement. It was at this time that the Prophet ﷺ married Lady Maymuna radiallahu anha. After the return, there were 4 more battles before the close of the year. So let me go through those quickly to round out this lecture. The Battle of Mut'ah took place in Jamad al-Awwal in the 8th year of the Hijrah. I don't know why, but for some reason in my notes I have it listed also as August/September of the year 629. I wish I had done that for the rest of the battles, but unfortunately I did not. This is the largest battle in the entire Sira, so it's not a minor thing. This is essentially an introduction to what will happen after the Prophet ﷺ passes. This is in the south of present-day Syria. And the reason behind this is that the Prophet ﷺ sent an ambassador, Harith ibn Umayr, to Busra, and he was killed by the Ghassanid overlord there, which was an act of war. So the Prophet ﷺ put together an army of 3,000 people, which was up until this time the largest army ever assembled under the banner of Islam. The head of the army was Zayd ibn Haritha, and the order was if he was killed, it would be Ja'far, and if he was killed, it would be Abdullah ibn Rawaha. The flag of the army was white, and this is the hadith. This episode brings us the hadith that has the clear rules of engagement about not harming the environment, not harming women, children, old people, holy people, etc. Intelligence report that 200,000 of the Byzantines were marching against them towards the south of the Levant. So 200,000 against 3,000. That's pretty bad. The odds. The military was gathering. Abdullah ibn Rawaha encouraged them to continue, saying, we fight for the deen. They had no fear. They reached to the area of Mu'tah, and they got ready. Sorry, this is the battle of Mu'tah. I said Mu'tah. Mu'tah is the temporary marriage. I'm getting my fiqh confused with my Sira. Mu'tah. And they got ready for battle. So there was fighting. So Zayd fought in the thick of this battle, and Ja'far fought until he was cut into two. So, this is pretty serious stuff. Can you imagine? It was just severed in half. That's how intense the fighting was. The Prophet ﷺ said he was given two wings in paradise. And this is why he is called Ja'far at-Tayyar, the flying one. Ibn Umar said, when I looked at Ja'far's body, he had over 50 wounds, all in his front, not one wound in his back. So he didn't retreat at all. Then Abdullah then took the flag. He was fought until he was killed. This is a crazy battle. For somebody to be cut in two, that's just, I don't even want to think about that. So, all of the people that were supposed to take the flag are gone. So Khalid ibn Walid, who the Prophet ﷺ said is one of the swords of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he takes up the flag and the leadership, and he said that on that day I fought and I broke 9 swords. Khalid ibn Walid. At the same time, the Prophet ﷺ was in Medina, through revelation, able to narrate to the companions what was happening in the battlefield. Khalid knew that the odds were against him, looking bad. So after the first day of the battle, he mixed up the army so that the Romans would think reinforcements had arrived. So he moved people around, so the Romans that were fighting would be, there must be a new batch of people, so they have reinforcements. And then what he did is, the second day of battle, Khalid, instead of taking a step forward with the army rearranged, he just took a step back. And then the Romans took a step back. So Khalid took another step back. So the Romans took a step back. And they kept doing that until enough distance, and then he returns to Medina, and by doing that, he saves the army. The death toll is that there were 12 Muslims died. No details on the Romans, but we assume it was much higher. And this is like the ultimate street cred. You took on an army of 200,000, the Roman Empire. This is going to be a massive thing. I know I'm over time, but I just have one more small battle. Let me just squeeze it in. At the Battle of Salasil, this took place in Jamad al-Akhir in the 8th year of the Hijrah. This was a reaction to Mu'tah. The Prophet ﷺ wanted to prevent an Arab-Roman alliance against him. Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhu was sent out in this mission. Reinforcements were needed, but there was success. And after this, there was no more northern Arab bloc to fight against Medina or to link with the Romans. And with that, we'll end today's lecture. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. All right, in today's lecture, alhamdulillah, we were able to talk about Khaybar, which is the major episode that takes place in the year 7 of the Hijrah. And we learned that Khaybar is 60 to 80 kilometers away from Medina. Two groups of fortresses, and very fortified, heavily armed. But yet the Prophet ﷺ, by going and laying siege, he's able to win quick, bloodless victories, because the people of Khaybar just capitulate and they get scared, but they regroup. Finally, there is some killing, but the Prophet ﷺ, capitulates with them, and he comes up with this treaty of 50% of the you have to de-arm yourself, and 50% of the return of the lands. The other Jewish tribes, the few of them that were against the Prophet ﷺ, they also took the same deal without any fighting. So this becomes a major flow of cash into Baitul Mal, into Dar al-Islam. And Then there are these like kind of minor. Now the north is secure. That's what I wanted to say. The north is now secure. The south has been secure because of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. The north is secure. Now the Prophet ﷺ is going to give his attention to the east, to Ghatafan, and that also is secure by almost no fighting. Just very few people die, and now it's kind of all secure. This allows the Prophet ﷺ the following year to go to make up the Umrah that they were not able to make when they went to Hudaybiyah, and this was also successful. And then we have the Battle of Mu'tah, which is in modern day Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan, in which the Prophet's army took on 3,000 against 200,000, and even though they didn't win the battle, they killed more Romans than the Muslims killed, and this becomes a huge psychological victory. And the Prophet ﷺ breaks the ability of the Arabs of the Levant to form an alliance with the Romans against the Muslims, and to break the stronghold of the Levantese Arabs to fight the Ghassanids, to fight Medina. So now we're on the verge of total victory. Really, this is kind of the south is secure, the north is secure, the east is secure, and now the threat of these major empires is secure. The Prophet ﷺ is already playing at an international power level. Next, we have to talk about the conquest of Mecca, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.